What actually is unallocated space? Once again, here I am trying to wrap my head around some HDD and file system concepts. When Windows displays a drive as having unallocated space and prompts for the drive to be initialized, what exactly does this mean? That the drive has no file system on it, or just that the file system isn't recognized by Windows? Is the concept of unallocated space a Windows one, or a hard drive one? In other words, is it possible for other operating systems to write to unallocated space? If so, does this mean that outside of Windows, a file system isn't necessary to write to a hard drive?
A hard drive, or its equivalent such as a USB thumb drive, by convention has a partition table on it. An MBR, Master Boot Record, style partition table fits in one sector, 512 bytes, at the beginning of the drive, sector number 0. An MBR also contains a bootloader, so the partition table space is limited to 4 primary partitions, though some 1980 software supported 8 partitions. Each MBR partition entry has a type code, a single byte, indicating that the corresponding partition is either NTFS, FAT32, 4 flavors, FAT16, 8 flavors, FAT12, Linux swap area, etc. Partition code 0, 0, means raw, or no meaningful content, or disregard partition contents. Whether the partition is flagged as bootable. Up to 1 partition per disk can have this flag enabled. The disk address of the beginning sector of the partition. The partition's ending sector, or the number of sectors. Early pieces used cylinder/head/sector numbers. After about 1995, use of logical block numbers, a single 32-bit value replaced cyl/head/sect addressing. Since a maximum of 4 partitions was soon intolerable, a mechanism for additional partitions was extended partitions in MBR, where a specially marked partition can have an embedded MBR containing another partition table. Thus it is possible to divide a disk into dozens of partitions, though some partitioning tools might inflict some artificial limit. A GPT is intrinsically not limited to 4 partitions. Its basics occupy more than 512 bytes on disk, usually something in the 4 to 16 megabyte range. But the meaning of partitions is the same. A disk's partition table, which has every sector of the disk included in it, has no unallocated space by the most common use of the phrase. So the usual answer to your question is that unallocated space is that outside of all partitions. However, ambiguity of terminology occurs if a partition is marked as type 0, raw, so there possibly could exist a tool which considers a raw partition as, in some sense, unallocated. When Windows displays a drive as having unallocated space and prompts for the drive to be initialized, what exactly does this mean? That the drive has no file system on it, or just that the file system isn't recognized by Windows? It means there is no partition table, or all the partition entries are empty. Windows is happy to ignore unrecognized file systems. Is the concept of unallocated space a Windows 1, or a hard drive 1? In other words, is it possible for other operating systems to write to unallocated space? It is a hard drive convention observed by all standard operating systems supporting PC software. Not sure what in other words means. Yes, it is possible to write to unallocated space, even in Windows, but the proper etiquette is to create a partition containing the unallocated space, format a file system within it, which writes to the unallocated space, and then write files and directories to it. If so, does this mean that outside of Windows, a file system isn't necessary to write to a hard drive. For a well-behaved system, no. Cooperative systems require file systems to be in place, permissions set appropriately, etc. However, it would be trivial in Linux, for example, to open the disk itself as a big file, raw disk access, and write directly to it. It would require administrative access and some guidance or calculations to determine where to write. However, ignoring file systems and partitions is bad. They greatly improve disk management and make life much easier and more sane. Ultimately, it is possible to write renegade software which completely ignores sanity and good manners and writes anywhere on the disk it wants. However, the meta-ness I perceive from this question might be misunderstanding whether you intend to obey the permissions and limits imposed by non-administrator/non-system mode in Windows, Linux, etc.
Is it possible for other operating systems to write to an allocated space? Yes, any OS can always write to any disk location, whether it's inside or outside a partition. Partitions are nothing more than a list of regions that the OS agrees to use. The disk always behaves as a single continuous storage medium and doesn't care about being partitioned. Indeed, the partition table itself is stored on the same disk, on sector 032-ish, and when tools like fdisk or diskpart edit partitions, all they do is update the table stored in those sectors. Does this mean that outside of Windows, a file system isn't necessary to write to a hard drive? It's not strictly necessary for most operating systems. A program with sufficient writes can open the raw device file such as /dev/sda4 on Linux or /device/harddisk5/dr5 on Windows and read/write bytes into any location. The program could practically invent its own private file system that way, or use some other structure. For example, there are SQL database engines which write the DB into a raw partition. Or it could just dump data wherever. File systems as you know them merely allow all programs within the OS to share the same drive or partition. The OS takes care of space allocation, reliability, etc., and programs don't need to think about anything other than files and folders. When Windows displays a drive as having unallocated space and prompts for the drive to be initialized, what exactly does this mean? That the drive has no file system on it, or just that the file system isn't recognized by Windows? When the disk management app prompts for the drive to be initialized, that means it does not even recognize the partition table, which is supposed to indicate which areas are allocated and which are not. Windows understands MBR and GPT partition tables, but when this prompt shows up, it means neither was found. Therefore, Windows doesn't even get to the point of looking at file systems. It cannot know where the file systems are, if there are any. However, when Windows finds a partition with unrecognized file system, disk management does not prompt to format or otherwise overwrite it. It simply shows that partition as having an unrecognized file system, often shortened as RAW. When other operating systems create their partitions on an MBR or GPT disk, they will generally honor the existing partition table and won't start using a different one. So if, for example, Linux or FreeBSD created its own partitions, they will be visible as actual partitions in disk management. As long as they're in the MBR or GPT, they won't simply turn into unallocated space just because the file system was not recognized. However, do not confuse diskng's prompt to initialize the disk with Windows Explorer's prompt to format the disk. The former is about unknown partition tables, but the latter is about unknown file systems in a known partition. Sometimes Windows accidentally assigns a drive letter to an unknown file system, and trying to open it via Windows Explorer will cause a format prompt. So in short, prompt to initialize disk no partition table, MBR or GPT, was found. The disk might be empty or it might use a non-standard partition table such as admin. No prompt, but unallocated space shown. The space is really unallocated. The disk's partition table has no entries that would correspond to that area. No prompt, but unknown partition shown. The partition contains an unrecognized file system. Prompt to format disk. The partition contains an unrecognized file system.
Let's first explain how a hard drive works. A hard drive has space, obviously. You create a partition scheme across the entire drive, and you fill that with partitions. A partition is a reservation in the partition space with a fixed size. This is a very basic explanation. If I add RAID to the mix, I fear the answer gets unnecessarily complex. If your hard drive has just one partition, and its size is smaller than the size of the hard disk, there is space left for another partition. This bit is called unallocated space. Now, does this mean you can always create a partition there? No. It is possible that another OS created a partition in that space that is completely unfamiliar by your OS. If this is the case, your OS will either see this as an unknown partition, or in the worst case as unallocated space. If you create a partition in unallocated space that is actually allocated by another OS, you will destroy the previous partition in most cases. There is another possibility: the drive has a partition scheme that is not familiar by your OS. If this is the case, the OS will think the drive is not initialized, and will ask you to initialize it. In Windows, it will either be GPT or MBR, but there are known cases where the drive, or SD card etc., is formatted for a special device, and its unique format is a form of security.
Other answers already tell a great deal. I'll just add a bit more details to fill some gaps. One of the questions the author asks is, if so, does this mean that outside of Windows, a file system isn't necessary to write to a hard drive? Actually, you don't need it even inside Windows. But the devil is in the details. At a low level, the hard drive is just a bunch of bytes that can be read and written. Each byte has a number, the first byte, the second byte, etc., and that's it. Just a bunch of numbered bytes. Note that there's no concept of a file or directory or partition or whatever. When an operating system wants to read or write to the drive, at the lowest level it just says to it, please give me bytes 123 to 456, or please write this data into bytes 789 to 1234. Or something like that. In fact, you can easily write a program like that too. If you're a programmer, all you need to do is open a special file name, /./physical drive 0, like a regular file, and you get full access to all the bytes on the drive, just as they are written. Note, this is under Windows. Under Linux you open one of the files under /dev, and other OCs might have other mechanisms still. Mind you, you'll need admin privileges for that, since you do get access to all the sensitive information on the drive. But other than that, that's all there is to it. I've done it myself. Now, actually, I've lied to you a bit. A little white lie. The drive doesn't actually deal in individual bytes. It reads and writes data in sectors. That's just a fancy name for a bunch of bytes at a time. For the spinning Rust kind of drives, the sectors are usually 512 bytes large. So when you read or write to the drive, you need to do it in 512 byte large chunks. So, Windows actually tells the drive get me sectors 1 to 5 or write to sectors 6 to 8. But it doesn't really change the whole idea. SSDs usually have larger sectors, and the sizes can vary between drives. Typically it's 4096 bytes, but there are drives with 2048 byte sectors, and probably other values too. Again, doesn't really matter, just something to keep in mind. The OS usually abstracts it away and allows you to read and write whatever, and then does a little extra work to make sure the result is what you expect it to be. Next step are the partition tables that Wally has nicely explained in his answer. The partition tables aren't anything that the drive cares about. All it cares about is reading and writing sectors of bytes. But we, humans, would like to split the drive into partitions, and that's where the partition tables come in. A partition table is, by convention, stored at the very start of the drive. It's probably documented in some standard somewhere too, so that all the tools and OCs have the same understanding of them. The MBR, Master Boot Record, table is an older standard. There's since 1982. Since at that time nobody had even dreamed of SSDs or sectors different than 512 bytes. The MBR was designed to take up exactly one sector, 512 bytes, and had a bunch of other limitations, particularly relating to larger drive sizes. Eventually the drives got large enough that MBR just wasn't enough, and GPT, Git Partition Table, was introduced to get around those limits. Now, whichever format you use, all that the partition table actually says is something along the lines of the Partition 1 exists on sectors 50 to 5000 and is formatted with the FAT32 file system. The partition 2 exists on sectors 5001 to 10,000 and is formatted with the X4 file system, and so on. From this the OS can find the actual partitions and parse the file systems. And that's where you get files and folders and permissions and other stuff that the OS provides you with. This is all done in software. And here's another thing to note. As I said, the partition tables are a convention, not a necessity. Hardware doesn't care about it, software does. So you can use a drive even without one. For example, this day and age, it's common practice to use LVM and Linux to manage your hard drives. It's a bit of a long story. And one possibility with that is to add a whole drive to the pool of devices managed by LVM. In this case, there will be no partition table on the drive. LVM will manage it instead.